into the Book of Ruth in our exploration of Revelation 5. And this week we'll continue that focus. We're going to see what that scroll is and the whole scene from Revelation 5 is really all about, what Ruth has to tell us. I know it may seem disjointed at first. How do you relate these? But lay the groundwork, build up to it. You'll see it all ties together. So by way of review, we read chapter 5 of Revelation. We saw how the Lord was on his throne holding a scroll. It had writing on the inside and the out. Some translations say book, but books didn't exist yet. What we think of as book was called a codex. At the time, it was bound pages. Those don't show up until about the 2nd century AD. So before that, we had scrolls. And scrolls were made of papyrus, and that was made from bulrushes. Those are about 15 feet tall. They grow about 6 feet underwater. You go down, they're about as thick as a wrist. You gotta go down and cut them with a special knife. And then they extract the pith from this. And the pith was cut into thin strips, and it was laid out horizontally, then it was laid out vertically, and alternating like that. And they wet this with water and glue, kind of like you would paper mache today, but thicker. They pressed it together and they beat it with a mallet. And then they rolled it, they smoothed it with a pumice stone, and then they cut it into 8 by 10 sheets. So you ever wonder why we use that size paper? It's been that way for a long time. Then we're like, well, we gotta measure it up a bit, 8.5 by 11, just to be weird. So then they would join them, and you could write, but you had to write in very narrow 3-inch columns with a 3/4 inch break between them. They had all these rules. And each page had a 2.5 inch margin, top and bottom, and they rolled them with a wooden roller. They were more specific than we think back then on how things were done. They had a lot of rules to this. So Jude, 2nd and 3rd John, Philemon were all 1 sheet each. They're all contained on 1 8 by 10. Romans was 11.5 feet long, because that's Paul, right? So Revelation was 15 feet long. Mark was 19 feet long. John was 23.5 feet long. Matthew's scroll was 30 feet long. Luke's and Acts were both 32 feet each. So it looks like Luke wins for the longest winded scroll. But because of how paper was made, the scrolls were 2-sided. And the front side was called the recto, and it had a horizontal grain, and that's where you wrote on. The back side was called an epistograph, and it was rough and uneven. It was very rare to have writing on the outside. So this is going to matter later. Okay, so it's not a common thing to find writing on the outside of a scroll when we're dealing with scrolls. Okay. We also looked at how prophecy differs from what we see in our Western minds, how it's speaking for God in a biblical standpoint. It's not talking about the future like we think of today. That is the more Greek mindset that carried forward. So we dove into Ruth, and we started looking at the names, starting point of the story, where they were, the layout of the events. This was a famine. It was the one that occurred during the life of Gideon. You didn't know Biden was that old, but apparently Bidenomics existed back during Gideon. So, you saw how it had to be very severe for the family in order to uproot and cut away their home, their connections, sell their land for one reason or another, and travel as foreigners into a land where they have to survive only through the generosity of others. They had no ties there, they had no rights there. So you can imagine the situation you'd have to be in if you were to do this somewhere else today. So the sons of Ahimelech and Ruth married women from Midian, something that was against the law of Moses. Except the family was no longer part of the congregation of Israel, so maybe they loopholed it. They lived outside Israel, and it kept those sons away, or it kept the daughters away from being part of the congregation of Israel in a way. But then Ahimelech dies, then both sons die. They leave Naomi alone with the 2 daughters-in-law, both of whom were told by Naomi to go back home. You really need someone to read her part with a good New York Jewish accent. It really deserves that when you read her argument. It's just that kind of logical argument to get them to stay. It makes the most sense. Back home, they'd have food, they'd have family, they'd have connections, they'd have the dowries, they've had whatever, support that they'd have, but they'd have to leave all that behind to go with her. Orpah, not Oprah, Orpah realized that the safety and logic of this choice made it the way to go, so she went back home. But that same logic worked the opposite on Ruth, because Ruth saw it as the fact that Naomi has nothing to offer her is exactly why she needs to be there, exactly why she needs to care for her. So Orpah goes back to obscurity, and Ruth is forever remembered. She showed a love that was foreign to us. I mentioned we have some crazy concepts about love in this world, and I really feel that the ancient Greeks had a much better handle on this because they recognized that love has various forms to it. They are legitimate forms, but they are not all the same. We tend to use one word to try to encompass all of these, and it gets very confusing, and it sets really poor expectations in relationships. I've used the one before, but I love my wife, I love pizza. See, you assume you know which is more, but that's the problem with English. You have to assume that, see? So, and nowadays, with relationships we see and divorce rates, so it leads to these problems. So anyway, Ruth has agreed to go back with her mother-in-law to her home country. So this requires her to leave everything behind. This was all located in Moab. Moabites had very little dealings with the Israelites. They didn't always get along very well. You only have a few occasions where they did. They were specifically mentioned in the law for different reasons as being problematic, as being removed, and them and the Ammonites are specifically separated out by Moses in Deuteronomy. So Ruth will not be accepted by the Israelites when she goes there. Understand this. She's not. She can't even expect that. She's leaving behind her status and rights in Moab. Naomi has lost everything. She has nothing she can offer Ruth, because that's all tied to her husband who sold everything when they left. Now, the interesting thing is, you'd think Ruth could just get remarried or get married in Israel and be fine, but they're forbidden by law. She can't join them, so she can't marry. And no Gentile can marry into Israel as per Deuteronomy 7:2-3. So these are all good reasons to stay behind. So from there, we read Ruth, starting in verse 15 of chapter 1. And then she, Naomi, said, "Behold, your sister-in-law has gone back to her people and her gods. Return after your sister-in-law." But Ruth said, "Do not urge me to leave you or turn back from following you. For where you go, I will go. Where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people. Your God, my God. When you die, I will die. Where you die, and there I will be buried. Thus may the Lord do to me, and worse, if anything but death parts you and me." So we have to appreciate that the Moabites are very different from the Hebrews in many ways. They had different gods from the Hebrews, and that makes a major difference. We don't appreciate that as much today, especially coming from a nation that claims to be Christian. And you grow up around people with similar values, and you don't really appreciate how much of a difference this made in their times and cultures. Moab, their main god was named Chemosh. We don't know a huge amount about the Moabites. His actual name at the time was Atar Chemosh. He was considered the father of the Moabites, their creators. Each one of these cultures had what they called a father god. And he was the one that was the father of the nation, birthed nation. We found this thing called the Moabite stone. And it's a black basalt memorial stone that was discovered in Moab by a German missionary in 1868. It's just under 4 feet tall. It's got 34 lines written in a Semitic language similar to Hebrew, which most Semitic languages were similar to Hebrew. It's dated to 850 BC. It's written by a king of theirs named Mesha. And King Mesha records the same events we find in 2 Kings 3, 4 through 27. We call it the massacre at Nebo. Shocking for some, I'm sure, that yet the things that people want to argue against the Bible are actually substantiated by actual historical records and evidence. It confirms not only the events from the Bible, but it mentions at least 15 different sites listed in the Bible, corroborating that they existed. Just because you haven't found it doesn't mean it doesn't exist. Some of the stone is in the Louvre in Paris. It shows that the king honors Atar-Chemosh in much the same way that the Israelites honored Yahweh. Let me read it to you. Let me read part of it. And Chemosh said to me, this is the king talking, "Go take Nebo from Israel." So I went by night and I fought against it from the break of dawn until noon, taking it and slaying all, 7,000 men, boys, women, girls, and maidservants. For I had devoted them to the destruction for the god Ashtar-Chemosh. I took from there people of Yahweh, dragging them before Chemosh. Now this is the same event from 2 Kings 3, 26 to 27, but from the opposite viewpoint. In 2 Kings we read, when the king of Moab saw that the battle was too fierce for him, he took with him 700 men who drew swords to break through the king of Edom, but they could not. Then he took his oldest son, who was to reign in his place, and offered him as a burnt offering on the wall. And there came great wrath against Israel, and they departed from him and returned to their own land. So great wrath is poured on Israel. From who? Chemosh, God. Great wrath from the people. God obviously backed off. There's some failure, because Israel doesn't lose when God's on their side. The shocking part here is that Atar-Chemosh, or Ashtar-Chemosh, as it says in the stone, accepted human sacrifice, and they knew this. So he offers his son. I don't know how you do that. You just take your oldest son, like, I'm losing. Sorry, son. And I offer you as a burnt offering on the wall. That's crazy to think in our culture that you would do that, But for a battle, right? Like one battle. Not like this is the end-all thing. It's just one battle. But we know that this is the thing. They accept human sacrifice. So we see this God show up again with Solomon. In 1 Kings 11, 4 through 7, it says, "For when Solomon was old, his wives turned his heart away after other gods, and his heart was not wholly devoted to the Lord his God, as the heart of David his father had been. For Solomon went after Ashtaroth, the goddess of the Sidonians, and after Milcom, the detestable idol of the Ammonites. Solomon did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. He did not follow the Lord fully, as David his father had done. Then Solomon built a high place for Chemosh, the detestable idol of Moab, on the mountain which is east of Jerusalem, and for Molech, the detestable idol of the sons of Ammon." Now, there's some translational oopses in here, but the mountain to the east may shock you. There's only one. The mountain to the east of Jerusalem is what we call the Mount of Olives. So you know the Mount of Olives in the New Testament, right? But the Mount of Olives is where King Solomon decided to build this. Now, this mountain, he built these around 950 BC. They stood for about 3 centuries until King Josiah tears them down in 2 Kings 23:13. The high places which were before Jerusalem, which were on the right of the mountain of destruction, where Solomon the king of Israel had built for Ashtaroth, the abomination of the Sidonians, and for Chemosh, the abomination of Moab, and for Milcom, the abomination of the sons of Ammon, the king defiled. So he went in and wiped them out. So it's interesting because there's a few things I want to point out. In this, you see 3 gods listed, and it's very interesting because his name was Atar-Chemosh. It literally means war god, Chemosh. What you'll find with these ancient names is a lot of them aren't even really names. They're just descriptors. Kind of like the Lord calls the devil Satan, but it's a descriptor. He's the adversary. He's the enemy, right? So it's not his name. It's like a title of responsibility. Atar Chemosh is a war god. And you will see what happens is that part gets split off. Atar or Astar becomes Astaroth. And she's essentially the sex goddess of the Phoenicians. They become separate. And the war god parts are removed from her, and she's made into this. And the two and the one become two, and then the two become a couple, and they survive with name changes. And the only time you'd probably recognize the two of them other than this is they are Ares and Aphrodite in Greek. This is the same couple. And so one represents sex, one represents war, which go there pretty well. So I tell you this because I want you to get a flavor for this culture she's coming out of. It's quite a bit different. So coming over to Israel, and they already thought Israel was weird because they only had one God. And you see that in some of the other writings that, you know, they thought of Yahweh as a war god because the only time these other cultures ran into him was when they got their butts kicked by Israel. So clearly he's a war god. But they only had this one God. That was very weird. So it's very beyond foreign because of their views. And she's turning her back on her gods and going under a foreign God, Yahweh. And it wasn't like all that uncommon to switch gods, especially in a culture where you have multiples, but you have to understand that you might be asking for the wrath of your God. Right? In your mind, this is inviting trouble. And if you went to another one that's under the same group, maybe not. But you go to one that's outside in a different area, you could be inviting some serious trouble. Mind you, in their minds, the gods are very territorial and they stay within their area. This is why Jonah thought he could escape God by leaving Israel, because the gods stayed in their area. This was their mindset. And so he didn't realize God saw everything. This is a huge move for her. And she knows that she could put herself under the punishment of this new God in her mind. So she even says that she will accept this if anything but death separates the two of them, this new God. This is a multi-fold statement that she makes to Naomi. There are actually several statements here. Guess how many? 7. Where you go, I will go. Where you live, I will live. Your people will be my people. Your God will be mine. Where you die, I will die. There I will be buried. Those are actually separate concepts. And the Lord can do to me or more if I leave for any reason other than death. So you've got 7 separate statements there. Because if you notice in the Old Testament, where you die is not where you're buried a lot of times. So that's true today too. A similar formula is used multiple times, actually, in Samuel and Kings. Eli and Samuel in 1 Samuel 3:17. Saul talking about Jonathan's execution in 1 Samuel 14:44. Jonathan talking about David in 1 Samuel 20:13. David talking about Nabal in 1 Samuel 25:22. David talking about Amasa in 2 Samuel 19:13. Ben-Hadad talking about Samaria in 1 Kings 20:10. The king of Israel talking about Elijah in 2 Kings 6:31. So 7 times you see a similar formula for that statement being used. But continuing on, verse 18 of Ruth. When she saw that she was determined to go with her, she said no more to her. So they both went until they came to Bethlehem. And when they had come to Bethlehem, all the city was stirred because of them. And the women said, "Who is this Naomi?" She said to them, "Do not call me Naomi, call me Mara, for the Almighty has dealt very bitterly with me. I went out full, but the Lord has brought me back empty. Why do you call me Naomi, since the Lord witnessed against me, and the Almighty has afflicted me?" So Naomi returned with, notice the Bible just ignores that entire thing. So Naomi returned with Ruth, the Moabitess, her daughter-in-law, who returned from the land of Moab, and they came to Bethlehem at the beginning of the barley harvest. This is not a short trek. This is 75 miles. Now, for us today, that's not so bad. We get in our car, we drive, and depending on how much you break the speed limit, it could be anywhere from 50 to 90 minutes a trip. It could be shorter. On foot, no, it's not that easy. Especially, it is not a straight route, and it is not a level route. They had to descend from the Moab highlands, could be only one, down to the Jordan Valley, which is about 4,500 foot elevation they have to go down, which would be an amazing trek on a bike, straight down that hill, 4,500 feet, full speed. Ruth with a GoPro on her head, woo, ha ha. They didn't have GoPros back then. Anyway, after that, then you got to walk back up to Bethlehem, which is 3,750 feet, 3,750 feet up. So you really need to let the bike go full speed if you're going to try to come back up that. This is through desert territory known as the wilderness of Judah. So when she gets there, Naomi tells Ruth, stop calling her Naomi, call her Mara, which is the Hebrew for Mary. And this changes the meaning of her names, of course, because Naomi means pleasant. Mara or Mary means bitter. You can't really blame her, because after walking those hills, you probably would be bitter by the time you get there. She uses the word, we say Shaddai, but it's actually like El Shaddai, but it's actually Shaddai. And it is an interesting name to use because it's not used that much. It's one of the rarer titles. She feels a bit betrayed by him. She feels that he's abandoned her when her family's the one that went to another country under different gods. Sure. You married into forbidden culture, but yeah, God left you, sure. They arrive at the beginning of the barley harvest. Barley ripens before wheat. It could be as early as March, usually around April, or the Hebrew month of Abib. So it's actually a happy time, typically. Let me talk about the calendar for a second. We know that the Bible's based on sevens all the time. If you don't see any, you're not looking hard enough because they're there. But so are they as a people. So we talk about a week. We have a week. How many days are in a week? 7. Our weeks go from Sunday to Saturday. But see, to them, a week is not that. A week is a word that means set of 7. That's all it is. It's just a set of 7. So what we call a week, they would have a longer term. They call it a week of days. 7 days. We shortened it. Okay. We specifically mean that set, usually when we use it. So we'll talk about last week, this week, 2 weeks ago, and that tells you what week the day we're talking about was in. They just mean 7 days. More like we would say in a week's time, in 7 days. It just was a set of 7. And so they use the word week to mean any collection of 7. So you can have 7 weeks of anything, or a week of anything. A week of weeks is 7 weeks, right? 49 days. A week of months is 7 months, what we call a year, because they only used 7 months in the religious calendar. They also have what's called a sabbatical week, which is a set of 7 years. And then 7 plus 1 is the Jubilee year. It's the 50th every time. During that year, all land reverts to its owners, all slaves go free, and all debts are forgiven. So naturally, it's much harder to find a loan as you get closer to the 50th year because they know you're not going to pay it back. See, because it goes away. So if somebody gave you a loan on the year 49, that next year your debt's forgiven. It's the best time to get a new house because you ain't paying for it. But the loan terms are going to be monstrous. You know, you can imagine the interest rate. It's like, look, I ain't getting my money back. This is like 12,000% interest. So in this culture, since I mentioned it, land has to stay within the tribe. It can't be sold outside the tribe. okay? And it's not like completely sold, because every Jubilee it gets shifted back. Okay, so it doesn't stay for long. This matters because the Israel is God's land. He allocated its usage to the descendants of Abraham. Even though all of creation is his, he specifically picks this plot of land in its original boundaries as his. Okay? And he means it. This land is then divided among the 12 tribes. And even though there's technically 13, but the Levites weren't allowed to own land, okay? Since I mentioned it, slavery is mentioned in the Bible, and I do want to make a point. It's in the Bible, it can lead to confusing situations because, like love, the same word is used a little too loosely. And so some people will argue, see, slavery's in the Bible. Okay, not in the way you think it is, because what they mean is not what we mean. When we think of slavery, we think of someone being forced to work in chains under dire conditions against their will, forced servitude of another. They own you. This is the kind that people think of when they try to attack the Bible this way. It does not condone this. In fact, God specifically hates this concept, and he mentions it. It's a sin in his eyes. The Jews were put into slavery by some of their enemies, especially when they were being judged. They lost this protection. They wanted to wander off and do their own thing, and he's like, fine, you want your own way? Have it, but this is where it's going to lead you. Slavery, as it's used in the Bible, is a payment instead. If I took out a loan from you and I couldn't pay it back, I had no income way to pay it back, the way I would pay it back is to work for you, as what they called a slave in English, but it's a different word. I would work for you. We have this concept in media when somebody goes to a restaurant and they can't pay the bill, and then they always have that like joke issue at the end where they're scrubbing dishes to pay for their dinner. It's the exact same concept. You work for me until you've worked enough to pay off what's owed. So, and God actually puts major stipulations on this, that they have to be treated very well. You can't treat them poorly. You can't disrespect them. They're to be taken care of, fed, given a place. You've got to take care of it. Now, mind you, all these people had more like what we'd call estates. Because, you get married, your son would get married, move back in with you. He'd add to your estate. So through the generations, you just ended up with more and more stuff. Okay? This word is mentioned by Paul. He talks about being a slave of Christ, a servant of Christ, a bond servant of Christ. That's the best term for it. It's doulos in Greek. It means bond servant. What happens is at the end of that time where you've paid your debt off, you may find that was a much better life than what you had before. You may find that, I couldn't pay your debt. I couldn't even pay my debts before. But now I'm living, I got a job, I'm taken care of. And they will then ask to stay on. And they're called a doulos. They have chosen this life. And this is actually a place of honor. They were elevated among any other normal servants. They had their ear nailed to a door. You take the ear and put it and nail it. And then they put a gold ring through it. I wonder where that comes from. So it was marked to you as a servant, as a bond servant, someone who chose this and is to be honored for that. Paul uses this word because as Christians, it fits us very well. You can only choose this position when your debts have been paid off and forgiven. So as a Christian, our debts are paid off. We're choosing to serve the Lord no matter what comes. We're honored for this by the Lord. So I want to explain that. It's rarely explained. But this is why Paul uses that term, because it's something that really only Christians can claim spiritually. So the Sabbath was the seventh day, and this day was honored by the Israelites as God instructed them to do. Sabbath is also a fairly generic term, more than you think. And this is why dating of the crucifixion can get tricky. They miss details. Sabbaths means appointed times, like an appointment. Okay? I wouldn't try using that word when you have to go to the dentist. I have a Sabbath with the dentist. These are usually happier times than dentist visits. But this applies to Saturday, but it also applies to a lot of days in their year. Let me show you. There are 52 of these naturally in a year. Okay, 52 weeks. So you've got 7 plus 7 holidays, which they call high Sabbaths. So in addition to the Saturdays, the 7 days of Passover, a day for Pentecost, a day for Yom Teruah, or the Feast of Trumpets, a day for Yom Kippur, or the Day of Atonement, 7 days for Sukkot, which is the Feast of Tabernacles or Booths, and then the Shemini Atzeret, which is the 8th day of assembly. And you add them up and you get 70. So there is a complete set of appointed times every year. These are appointed times because these are appointed meetings for you and the Lord. That's how he treated them. They were appointments that you were to keep. So you met the Lord at these times. As an aside, we have these little things called equidistant letter sequences, and it's what's referred to in the Bible as the Bible code. Not in the Bible, it's referred to as the Bible code. It's not made up. It's something that was discovered by a computer, actually. It could read the text and crunch the numbers. We found that there are these things called equidistant letter sequences. So every so many letters, a letter would appear, and it made a word. Now, you could do this with any word if you wanted to, so it can very easily be made meaningless. The problem isn't the words that you could find. The problem, what's amazing is the words you did find, where you found them, because they were focused on specific spots. It shows the thumbprint of the author, okay, but only in Hebrew and Greek. So the Hebrew word, for instance, Sabbath, occurs once in all of Genesis. Now, statistically, it should show up 5 times. If it were blind chance, it would show up 5 times. It only shows up once. One occurrence at an interval of 70 letters. And it's focused on the first chapter of Genesis. It may sound like coincidence, but coincidence is not a kosher word. The odds of this occurring without a person purposefully doing it is 70 million to 1. And these kind of things happen all the time. And they happen in very specific points and moments. So anyway, we're done with chapter 1. I'm going to look a little bit at chapter 2 before we close. Start in verse 1 of chapter 2. Now Naomi had a kinsman of her family, a man of great wealth, of the family of Ahimelech, whose name was Boaz. And Ruth, the Moabitess, said to Naomi, "Please let me go out to the field and glean among the ears of grain after one in whose sight I might find favor." So if someone will let me go gather grain for us. And she said to her, "Go, my daughter." So Ruth departed and went and gleaned in the field after the reapers. And she happened to come to the portion of the field belonging to Boaz, who was after the family of Ahimelech. Now behold, Boaz came from Bethlehem, and he said to the reaper, "May the Lord be with you." And they said, "May the Lord bless you." And then notice, Boaz doesn't ask, "How is it going?" He doesn't say, "How's the harvest? How's everybody feeling?" He says, "Who is she?" He's distracted immediately. Who is this woman? The servant in charge of the reaper said, "She is the young Moabite woman who returned with Naomi from the land of Moab." And he said, "Let me, please," and she said, "Please let me glean and gather after the reapers among the sheaves." Thus she came and has remained from the morning until now, and she's sitting in the house for a little while. She's resting. Now, we've all seen romantic comedies enough to know what happens next. This is when Mr. Darcy has been introduced, for those who know the story. And he's amazed by Ruth. And we see his interest immediately. She doesn't have any of these notions. She has no such illusion of grandeur because she knows she's not from there. She's not even thinking this way. It doesn't matter. He is. She seems to understand this position in the new land rather well. because she's there for her mother-in-law and really nothing else. She knows not to expect anything. He's related to Ahimelech. He is a very wealthy landowner. And this opens the door for the rest of the story to move along. His position is unique here. And yes, ladies, he's single. She goes to glean from his field after the reapers gather the harvest. And we'll go through that next week. But for now, we know this part. We've heard the story. We know the rest. He sees her, blown away with her. She doesn't notice a thing, completely oblivious. Reminds me of someone I know. She is the best thing since sliced bread to Boaz. That's an old statement now, but she's the most beautiful of God's creation that he's ever seen. And he immediately is interested and plans to help her out to make his move. As I close, though, none of this matters. It doesn't matter that he likes her. It doesn't matter that she happened in this field. It doesn't matter that he's going to help her out because she's forbidden from joining the family. She's a Moabitess. Not allowed. Yet, she is part of the lineage of Jesus. How can that be? The law excludes her from joining God's family. But she is not the only one in the Lord's lineage with questionable qualifications. We find in Matthew 4 5 different women: Tamar, Rahab, Ruth, the wife of Uriah, who is left nameless, and Mary. And 4 of them are not the people you'd expect to see in the lineage of the King of Kings. Tamar lied and deceived her father-in-law to commit incest in order to get an heir. None of that sentence is something you'd expect to hear in a church service. Rahab, most likely a harlot. I say that because the word actually took on that meaning later. The original Semitic root didn't actually carry that. Ruth is an outcast Gentile, had no right to even be there. The wife of Uriah was an adulteress. How did they ever become part of the family of the Messiah? A better question, how did we? Because we too are all forbidden from being part of God's family. We all fall under the same rules. We get to join, though, by trusting on the grace and mercy of the Lord, by throwing ourselves entirely upon his grace and mercy and believing that the blood of Christ will cover us. And as Paul says, I pray we're right, because without it, we have nothing. The law excludes us from joining the family. But grace includes us if we put our faith in Jesus and have a relationship with him. This is exciting. We're ready to go now. I mean, a lot of us are. Maybe not everybody. Some people are too young to be ready to go, but a lot of people are ready to go now. As I close, this is exciting. Sometimes, as part of God's family, we're ready for him to end it so we can just go home. Especially when we turn on the news at night, or we have to buy groceries. And we're ready for God to just go, come home. We're ready for him to remove that evil that we see around us. Sometimes we wonder what's taken him so long. We, too, are only here because he waited. He could have already come back and dealt with all this. He waited so that all of us could be part of this family. In 2 Peter 3:9, we read, "The Lord is not slow about his promises, as some count slowness, but is patient towards you, not wishing for any to perish, but that all would come to repentance." And praise God for that too, because otherwise we'd all be out of luck. He's waiting for what Paul says in Romans 11:25, the fullness of the Gentiles to come in. He's waiting for those who haven't made the choice yet, but are going to. So if you haven't, why not? You're holding the rest of us up. No. Seriously though, God knows no better time than today for you to come to him. The altar is open as always, and we're here to pray with you. Let's stand and sing.